Floyd County, Indiana, September 28th, 2000. The night air was thick with the hum of crickets and the distant rumble of cars on the highway. A gentle breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves and freshly cut grass across the rural neighborhoods of Georgetown, Indiana. It was a Thursday evening like any other in Floyd County, the kind where families gathered around dinner tables to discuss their days, where children finished homework, and where the rhythms of small-town America played out in predictable patterns. For former Indiana State Trooper David Camm, it had been an ordinary evening. He had left work at 7 p.m., driven the familiar route to Georgetown Community Church, and participated in his weekly basketball game with friends and neighbors. The squeak of sneakers on the polished gym floor, the satisfying swish of the net, the good-natured ribbing between players. These were the soundtracks of normalcy, of a life that would soon be shattered beyond recognition. At 9:26 p.m., David pulled his truck into the driveway of his home on Lockhart Road. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he approached the garage, its door already open, light spilling out into the darkness. As he later recalled to investigators, nothing seemed amiss from the outside. The house stood quiet and still, framed against the starlit Indiana sky. He parked, stepped out of his vehicle, and walked toward the garage, his mind already moving ahead to tomorrow's workday. What awaited him inside would become the defining moment of his life, a scene of horror that would launch a complex legal saga spanning more than a decade. The garage light cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor. David's eyes first fell on the family's Ford Bronco, parked in its usual spot. Then as he moved further inside, he saw a figure on the ground, his wife, Kim, lying motionless near the vehicle, a pool of dark liquid spreading beneath her head. For a moment, his mind refused to process the image, to accept what his eyes were telling him. Kim? He called her name, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. No response. Then his gaze shifted to the Bronco, and he saw his 5-year-old daughter, Jill, still strapped in her seatbelt, her small body slumped awkwardly against the restraint. And in the back seat, his 7-year-old son, Brad, also motionless, his blonde hair visible through the window. A primal surge of panic and disbelief washed over David. Later, he would struggle to articulate this moment to investigators, to juries, to anyone who hadn't experienced the psychic rupture of finding their family destroyed. His training as a state trooper, the years of responding to accident scenes and crime sites, dissolved in an instant, replaced by the raw, devastating instinct of a father and husband. David rushed to the Bronco, yanking open the door. He reached for Brad first, pulling his son's limp body from the vehicle. Brad's skin was still warm to the touch, giving David a desperate flicker of hope. He laid the boy gently on the garage floor and began CPR, his hands shaking as he compressed, his son's chest willing life back into him. "Breathe, buddy," he pleaded between compressions. "Come on, Brad, breathe for me." But even as he went through the motions, a part of him recognized the futility. The wounds were too severe, gunshot wounds to the head that had stolen his son's life instantly. Still, he continued compressions, counting aloud through his tears until the full weight of the situation crashed over him. His family was gone, murdered in their own garage. David staggered to his feet and rushed to the house phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator's voice seemed to come from another world. "1, what's your emergency?" "My family," David choked out, his voice breaking. "They've been shot. My wife and kids, they're all dead. Please, send help. Please. Sir, can you verify your location?" "It's 7533 Lockhart Road in Georgetown. Please hurry." "Sir, are you certain they're deceased?" David's response came through sobs. "Yes, they've been shot. They're not breathing. Please hurry." "Stay on the line, sir. Emergency services are on their way. But David had already dropped the phone, returning to his family in the garage, moving between them in helpless desperation, checking Kim's pulse, returning to Brad, looking at Jill still buckled in her seat. He touched their faces, called their names, unable to accept the finality of what had happened. Within minutes, the night exploded with the wail of sirens. Red and blue lights sliced through the darkness as first responders descended on the Camm residence. The first officers on scene found David in the garage, covered in his son's blood, inconsolable. "They're gone," he told the officers, his voice hollow. "Someone killed my family." The officers gently moved David away from the bodies, establishing a perimeter around what was now a crime scene. Paramedics confirmed what David already knew. Kim, Brad, and Jill Camm had been murdered, each killed by gunshot wounds. As the initial shock gave way to the mechanics of an investigation, something subtle but significant shifted in the atmosphere. The officers, many of whom had worked alongside David during his years as a state trooper, began to observe him with a different kind of attention. His reactions, his movements, his blood-stained clothing, all were now potential evidence in a triple homicide. Detective Sean Clemens arrived on scene at 10:11 p.m. He approached David, who sat in the back of an ambulance, a blanket draped over his shoulders. "David," Clemens began, his voice carefully neutral, "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions." David nodded, his eyes unfocused. "I was at basketball. I came home and found them. Someone shot my family." "What time did you leave the church gym?" "Around 9:20, maybe 9:22. It takes me about 5 minutes to get home," Clemens made a note. "Was anyone else at the house when you arrived?" "No. The garage door was open. I just pulled in and found them." "Did you touch anything besides your family members?" "I don't know. I tried to help Brad. I tried CPR." David looked down at his blood-stained T-shirt. "I tried to save him." As they spoke, other investigators moved through the scene, cataloging evidence, taking photographs. Crime scene technician Rod Englert paid particular attention to the spatter patterns on the garage floor and the small droplets on David's shirt, droplets that would soon become the centerpiece of the case against him. Within hours, as the bodies of Kim, Brad, and Jill were removed from the scene, the framework of the investigation began to solidify. And despite David's shocked protestations of innocence, despite his account of the basketball game and his discovery of the crime, the detective's focus narrowed almost exclusively to him. By sunrise on September 29th, less than 12 hours after, David Camm discovered his murdered family. The investigation had already formed a distinct shape, not a search for an unknown killer, but a building case against a husband and father who, in the eyes of investigators, had committed the unthinkable. In the grey morning light of September 29, 2000, the Camm family home transformed from a crime scene into the epicenter of what would become one of Indiana's most controversial investigations. Yellow police tape cordoned off the property, fluttering in the autumn breeze as a grim marker of the tragedy within. Inside the Indiana State Police post in Sellersburg, David Camm sat in an interrogation room. The shock of the previous night had given way to a dazed grief, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Across the table, detectives Sean Clemens and Gary Gilbert watched him carefully, their notepads open, pens poised. "Walk us through your day yesterday, David," Clemens began. "Start from when you left work." David spoke mechanically, recounting his drive to the church, the familiar faces at the basketball game, the unremarkable conversations during water breaks. His voice faltered only when he reached the moment he pulled into his garage. "You're saying you left the church at approximately 9:22 p.m., Gilbert clarified. "Yes," David nodded. "I checked my watch before leaving." "And you arrived home at what time?" "Around 9:26, 9:27. It takes about 5 minutes." The detectives exchanged glances. "That's a tight timeline," Clemens noted. "We've been talking to the other players. Some of them remember you leaving earlier." "No," David shook his head emphatically. "I stayed for all 3 games. Ask Tom Jolly or Jeff Lockhart. They were on my team for the last game." Gilbert scribbled something in his notepad. "Tell us about your relationship with Kim. Any problems?" There, the question seemed to catch David off guard. "What do you mean?" "Marital problems, David. Tensions. Arguments." "We were fine," David insisted, his brow furrowing. "Like any couple, we had our disagreements, but nothing serious. We were happy." Gilbert leaned forward. "We've been hearing differently. About affairs, David. Multiple affairs." A flush crept up David's neck. "That was in the past. I made mistakes. Years ago, but Kim and I worked through that. It has nothing to do with what happened yesterday." The questioning continued for hours, circling back to the timeline, to David's marriage, to his behavior upon discovering the bodies. With each pass, the detectives' queries became more pointed, their skepticism more evident. Meanwhile, across town, the forensic investigation was unfolding with its own momentum. In the state police laboratory, technicians examined the blood spatter evidence from the scene. Robert Steitz, a crime scene photographer with limited formal training in blood pattern analysis, studied the photographs of David's T-shirt. "These are high-velocity impact spatter patterns," Steitz declared to the lead investigators, pointing to the minute droplets on David's shirt. "Consistent with someone being in close proximity during the shooting. These could only have gotten on his shirt if he was the shooter." His assessment, delivered with confidence despite his lack of credentials as a blood spatter expert, became a cornerstone of the developing case. What Steitz didn't consider, what wouldn't be properly analyzed until years later, was the possibility that these droplets transferred to David's shirt during his desperate attempts to save his son through CPR. As the day progressed, other elements of evidence were collected and catalogued. The shell casings from the .380 caliber weapon used in the murders, fingerprints from the Bronco, and a mysterious grey sweatshirt found at the scene with the nickname Backbone written in the collar. This sweatshirt, which belonged to neither David nor any member of his family, should have immediately redirected the investigation. It was an anomalous object, clearly left by someone other than the Camms, yet in the developing narrative of David's guilt, it became a footnote, collected but not prioritized for testing or identification. Detective Mark Henderson examined the sweatshirt briefly, noting it in his report, but failing to recognize its potential significance. "Unknown article of clothing found near victim's vehicle," his notes read. "No obvious evidentiary value." The sweatshirt was bagged and stored, effectively removed from the immediate investigation, a critical error that would not be rectified for years. By evening on September 29th, just 24 hours after the murders, the investigative team convened to discuss their findings. The room was tense with the gravity of the case and the direction it was taking. "The blood evidence puts him at the scene during the shooting," Steitz asserted, "and his timeline doesn't add up. Some of the basketball players say he wasn't there for parts of the evening. Plus, we've got confirmation of multiple affairs," Detective Gilbert added, "including a recent one that his wife may have discovered." "What about forced entry?" asked a junior detective. "Any signs the garage was broken into?" Clemens shook his head. "None. The scene was clean, except for the victims and the evidence directly related to the shooting." "What about the sweatshirt?" the junior detective pressed. "The one that doesn't belong to anyone in the family." There was a moment of uncomfortable silence. "We'll look into it," Clemens said dismissively. "But right now, all signs point to the husband. It's almost always the spouse in cases like this. Let's focus on building that case." The meeting ended with a clear direction. Gather evidence to support David's arrest, not to explore alternative possibilities. On the morning of September 30th, David Camm was brought in for additional questioning. The tone had shifted noticeably from the previous day. No longer was he being treated as a grieving victim. Now he was unmistakably a suspect. "We've been looking at the evidence, David," Clemens began, his voice hard, "and your story doesn't hold up." "What are you talking about?" David's exhaustion was evident in the dark circles under his eyes, the slump of his shoulders. "The blood on your shirt, it puts you right there when the shots were fired. It's high-velocity spatter. That's from when I pulled Brad out of the car," David protested. "When I tried CPR, of course I got blood on me." Gilbert shook his head. "That's not what our experts say. These are specific patterns that only come from being present during the shooting." "That's impossible." David's voice rose. "I was at basketball. 11 people can verify that." "Can they verify exactly when you left? Because our timeline says you had time to go home, commit these murders, and then discover the bodies when you supposedly came home from basketball." The interrogation continued, growing more confrontational. David maintained his innocence, his bewilderment turning to anger as he realized the direction of the investigation. "I did not kill my family," he insisted, his voice breaking. "I loved them. Why aren't you out there looking for who did this?" But the decision had effectively been made. The investigators had their theory, a husband with a history of infidelity, with what they believed was blood spatter evidence linking him to the crime, with a timeline they believed could accommodate his guilt. Alternative explanations were not being pursued with any vigor. On October 1st, 2000, just 3 days after the murders, David Camm was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. The news spread quickly through Floyd County, a shocking development in an already sensational case. The former state trooper, the man who had discovered his family's bodies, was now accused of being their killer. The arrest was announced at a press conference where prosecutors outlined their case in broad strokes. They presented a narrative of a troubled marriage, of a husband who wanted out, of damning physical evidence. What they didn't mention was the grey sweatshirt with "backbone" written inside, the unidentified fingerprints on the Bronco, or the DNA samples that hadn't yet been tested. As David was processed into the Floyd County Jail, his uniform exchanged for inmate attire, the machinery of the criminal justice system lurched forward. A grand jury was convened. Witnesses were interviewed. Basketball players whose recollections of the timing would be crucial, women with whom David had had affairs years earlier, neighbors who had heard or seen nothing unusual on the night of the murders. What should have been a comprehensive investigation into all possible scenarios had narrowed prematurely into a single-track pursuit of David's conviction. The tunnel vision that would plague the case for years had already set in, blinding investigators to alternative paths and explanations. In the weeks that followed, as David awaited trial in a cell, the case against him solidified in the public consciousness, fueled by media reports that emphasized his affairs and the supposedly damning blood evidence. The narrative was compelling in its simplicity. A cheating husband, a desire for freedom, a brutal solution. But beneath this streamlined story lay complexities and contradictions that would eventually unravel the case. The investigation had overlooked key evidence, misjudged forensic findings, and disregarded the simplest of questions. If not David Camm, then who? That question should have led investigators to the grey sweatshirt, to the unidentified DNA, to a violent offender named Charles Boney, a man whose connection to the case would not be discovered for years. Instead, with David's arrest, the investigation effectively ceased its search for the truth, satisfied that justice was being served. It would take 13 years, 3 trials, and the persistent advocacy of those who believed in David's innocence to finally arrive at a different understanding of what happened on that September night in 2000. But in the fall of that year, as leaves changed color and fell from the trees, as the Camm family was laid to rest without their father and husband present. The die had been cast. David Camm was guilty in the eyes of the law enforcement community, in the eyes of the media, and in the eyes of many in Floyd County. His fight to prove otherwise was just beginning. The Floyd County Courthouse stood as a monument to justice in the heart of New Albany, Indiana, its limestone facade and columned entrance projecting an air of solemnity and permanence. On January 7, 2002, as David Camm's first trial began, the building was surrounded by news vans and reporters, their cameras trained on the courthouse steps, awaiting the day's proceedings. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. The gallery was packed with spectators, members of both David's and Kim's families, seated on opposite sides like opposing armies, their faces etched with grief and determination. Reporters filled the back rows, notebooks at the ready. At the defense table, David sat beside his attorneys, David Stites and Catherine Kitty Leal, his face thinner than it had been 15 months earlier, his eyes constantly moving between the judge's bench, the jury box, and the faces of his supporters. The prosecution team, led by Floyd County Prosecutor Stanley Faith, arranged their materials at their table, conferring in hushed tones. They projected confidence, certain in the case they had built against the former state trooper. Judge Jonathan Dart called the court to order, the sound of his gavel cutting through the murmurs. The state of Indiana versus David Ray Camm. He announced, "The court is now in session." Prosecutor Faith approached the jury for his opening statement, his voice resonating in the high-ceilinged room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this case is about betrayal in its most fundamental form. The evidence will show that on September 28, 2000, the defendant, David Camm, murdered his wife and 2 young children in cold blood. You will hear about the physical evidence that places him at the scene during the shootings, not after, as he claims, but during. You will hear about his motive, his history of infidelity, his desire to escape his marriage, and the life insurance policies worth more than $750,000 that he stood to collect." Faith paced before the jury, his words painting a picture of calculation and brutality. "The defendant wants you to believe he was playing basketball miles away when these murders occurred. But the evidence, specifically the blood spatter on his T-shirt, tells a different story. It tells us he was there, gun in hand, when his family's lives were ended." When Faith concluded, Kitty Leal rose for the defense's opening. Her approach contrasted sharply with Faith's emotional intensity. She was methodical, emphasizing the scientific weaknesses in the state's case. "The prosecution has just told you a story," she began, "a story they've constructed to fit their theory. But when you examine the actual evidence, not their interpretation of it, but the evidence itself, you'll find that David Camm is innocent of these terrible crimes. The blood on his shirt came from his desperate attempts to save his son's life, not from firing a weapon. 11 people will testify that David was with them, playing basketball at the time these murders occurred. The prosecution's timeline is not just improbable, it's impossible." She paused, making eye contact with individual jurors. "Most importantly, you'll learn about the evidence that wasn't investigated. A sweatshirt found at the scene that belonged to neither David nor any member of his family. DNA on that sweatshirt that wasn't tested, fingerprints that weren't identified. The police decided David was guilty within hours, and they built their case backward from that conclusion, ignoring anything that contradicted it. As the trial proceeded, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Basketball players from the church gym testified to David's presence that night, though their recollections of exact times varied, variations the prosecution seized upon to suggest gaps in David's alibi. The testimony that perhaps damaged David the most came from women with whom he had had affairs years earlier, during a troubled period in his marriage. Though these relationships had ended long before the murders, though they had no direct relevance to the crimes charged, their inclusion painted David as morally suspect. David Camm, a woman with whom David had had a brief relationship in 1997, testified through tears. "He told me his marriage was essentially over," she said, "that they were staying together for the kids." "And did he express desire to leave his wife?" Faith asked. "Yes, he said he would, eventually." On cross-examination, Leal attempted to contextualize these statements. "Ms. Camm, when did your relationship with David end? In late 1997, more than 3 years before the murders?" "Yes." "And to your knowledge, did David and Kim Camm reconcile after that period?" "I think so. That's what I heard." "So your knowledge of their marriage in September 2000 is non-existent?" "Objection," Faith interrupted. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Judge Dart ruled, but perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Robert Stites, the crime scene photographer who had analyzed the blood spatter on David's shirt. Stites testified with unwavering certainty about the blood patterns, describing them as high-velocity impact spatter that could only have been present if David was within 4 feet of the victims when they were shot. "These aren't transfer stains from contact with the victims after death," Stites testified, pointing to enlarged photographs of David's shirt. "These are characteristic of the fine mist that's expelled when a bullet enters a body." What the jury didn't know, what wouldn't come to light until much later, was that Stites had misrepresented his credentials. He was not a certified blood spatter analyst, but a photographer who had taken some courses in the subject. His interpretation of the blood evidence would eventually be contested by genuine experts in the field. The defense brought forward their own witnesses. Tom Jolly, one of the basketball players, testified firmly about David's presence at the games. "He was there the whole time," Jolly insisted. "We were on the same team for the last game. I distinctly remember him guarding me during a play right before we all left." "And what time did the games end?" Lyle asked. "Around 9:20, 9:22. We all walked out together to the parking lot." The defense also called Dr. Robert Shaler, a respected forensic scientist, who challenged Stites' interpretation of the blood evidence. "The patterns on Mr. Camm's shirt are consistent with transfer that could have occurred during efforts to provide aid to the victims," Dr. Shaler testified. "They are not conclusively high-velocity impact spatter, as Mr. Stites claims, but in a critical strategic error, the defense failed to adequately address the grey sweatshirt found at the scene. They mentioned it, but didn't emphasize its significance, a foreign object that pointed to an outside perpetrator, an alternative explanation that should have introduced reasonable doubt." As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides presented their closing arguments. Faith reiterated the state's theory, emphasizing the blood evidence and suggesting that David had managed to slip away from the basketball game unnoticed, commit the murders, and return before anyone realized he was gone. Leal countered by emphasizing the timeline's impossibility, the questionable blood spatter analysis, and the 11 alibi witnesses who placed David at the basketball game. After 5 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on March 15, 2002. For 2 days, the 12 men and women deliberated, reviewing evidence, debating interpretations, weighing testimony. On March 17th, they returned with their verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, David Ray Camm, guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted in contrasting reactions, gasps and sobs from David's supporters, grim satisfaction from Kim's family. David himself seemed to collapse inward, his face a mask of disbelief as officers moved to handcuff him. Judge Dart sentenced David to 195 years in prison, 65 years for each life he was convicted of taking. As he was led from the courtroom, David turned to his parents in the gallery. "I didn't do this," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm innocent." For many, the case was closed. Justice had been served. But for others, particularly those who had known David personally. Questions lingered. The evidence had been circumstantial, the timeline problematic, the motive questionable, and there was still the matter of the unidentified sweatshirt, the DNA that hadn't been fully analyzed, the possibility that someone else had murdered the Camm family. David's legal team immediately began working on an appeal. They identified numerous problems with the trial: the admission of prejudicial testimony about David's affairs, the reliance on questionable blood spatter analysis, the failure to fully investigate alternative suspects. Their persistence paid off. On August 10, 2004, the Indiana Court of Appeals overturned David's conviction, ruling that the testimony about his extramarital affairs had unfairly prejudiced the jury. The court ordered a new trial, a rare legal victory that offered David a second chance to prove his innocence, but the wheels of justice turned slowly. David remained incarcerated as the prosecution prepared for a second trial, and in the intervening years, a significant development occurred, one that would reshape the case entirely. In 2005, 5 years after the murders, defense investigators finally convinced authorities to run DNA tests on the gray sweatshirt found at the scene. The results were electrifying. The DNA matched a man named Charles Boney, a convicted felon with a history of violent crimes against women. Backbone was Boney's nickname, the very name written in the collar of the sweatshirt. His prison records confirmed this moniker, a detail that had been overlooked for half a decade while David Camm sat in prison. Further investigation revealed that Boney's palm print matched an unidentified print on the outside of the Camm's Bronco. Suddenly, there was undeniable physical evidence placing a violent offender at the crime scene. For David's supporters, this seemed like vindication, proof of his innocence and of the tunnel vision that had plagued the investigation from the start. But the prosecution adapted their theory rather than abandoning it. Instead of acknowledging a significant error, they now claimed that David and Boney had worked together to commit the murders. Charles Boney was arrested and charged as David's accomplice. In a separate trial held in January 2006, Boney was convicted of the Camm murders and sentenced to 225 years in prison. During his trial and in subsequent interviews, Boney offered conflicting accounts of what happened that night, alternately denying any involvement and claiming David had masterminded the killings. With Boney convicted, the stage was set for David's second trial. Floyd County prosecutor Keith Henderson, who had replaced Stanley Faith, pursued a new theory, that David had hired Boney to help him kill his family. The motive shifted as well. Now prosecutors suggested David had molested his daughter Jill and committed the murders to cover up the abuse. This explosive new allegation, introduced without substantive evidence, further inflamed public opinion against David. Though no physical evidence of abuse was ever found, though the autopsy reported no signs of molestation, the mere suggestion tainted the proceedings. David's second trial began in January 2006 in Warwick County, Indiana, after a change of venue due to pretrial publicity. The evidence presented largely mirrored the first trial, with two significant additions: the DNA linking Charles Boney to the scene and Boney's own testimony against David. Boney took the stand, claiming David had contacted him to purchase an untraceable gun. According to Boney's account, he met David at the Camm home on the night of the murders, unaware of David's intentions. He claimed he was outside the garage when he heard gunshots, then saw David with the weapon. He pointed the gun at me, Boney testified. He said, "You're next," but the gun was empty. He ran off and I panicked and left my sweatshirt behind. This testimony strained credulity. It didn't explain why Boney's palm print was on the Bronco, why his DNA was on Kim Camm's sweater, or why he had brought a sweatshirt to what he claimed was a simple gun sale on a warm September evening. Despite these inconsistencies, despite the defense's detailed timeline proving David's presence at the basketball game, despite improved expert testimony challenging the blood spatter evidence, the outcome remained the same. On March 3, 2006, David was again convicted on 3 counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. Once more, David's legal team appealed. And once again, they were successful. On June 26, 2009, the Indiana Supreme Court overturned the second conviction, citing the prosecution's unfounded molestation accusations as prejudicial and inadmissible. For a third time, David would face trial for the murders of his family. For a third time, he maintained his innocence. And for a third time, the prosecution adapted their theory, now claiming the motive was a $750,000 life insurance policy. The saga of David Camm, a case plagued by prosecutorial overreach, questionable forensic science and investigative tunnel vision, had already spanned nearly a decade. Through it all, David had aged in prison, missed the funerals of his wife and children, lost years of his life to incarceration. Yet as preparations began for his third trial, he clung to hope that the truth would finally prevail. The hot August. Sun beat down on Louisville, Kentucky, as Charles Darnell Boney sat in an interview room at the Indiana State Prison. It was 2007, and Boney had been convicted of the Camm family murders the previous year. With nothing to lose, he had agreed to an interview with investigative journalist Richard Schlesinger for the CBS program 48 Hours. Across the table, Schlesinger studied the man whose DNA and fingerprints had been found at the crime scene, whose sweatshirt had sat in evidence storage for 5 years before being properly tested. "Let's start at the beginning," Schlesinger suggested. "How did you come to be involved in this case?" Boney's account was convoluted and had changed significantly over time. In this telling, he claimed David Camm had contacted him through a mutual acquaintance to purchase an untraceable gun. "I met him at a basketball court in New Albany," Boney said, his voice steady. "He said he needed a clean weapon. I didn't ask. Why? And you provided this gun?" Schlesinger pressed. "Yes, a .380 caliber. I got it from a guy in Louisville." "Then what happened?" "He called me on September 28th, said he needed to meet. I went to his house that evening. I didn't know what he was planning." Schlesinger's expression remained neutral, though his skepticism was evident in his questioning. "So you're saying you brought the sweatshirt with you? The one with your DNA? And your nickname written inside?" Boney shifted in his chair. "Yeah, it was getting cooler in the evenings. I took it off while I was waiting." "And you left it at a crime scene? When I heard the shots, I panicked. I ran. I forgot it." The interview continued, with Boney offering details that contradicted his previous statements to police and his testimony at trial. What emerged was a narrative riddled with inconsistencies and improbabilities. What Boney couldn't explain, what the prosecution in David's trials had never adequately addressed, was why his DNA was found not just on the sweatshirt, but also on Kim Camm's sweater and broken fingernail, suggesting physical contact. He couldn't explain why his palm print was on the Bronco in a position consistent with holding the vehicle's door open. And he couldn't provide a coherent account of his own whereabouts during the critical time frame when the murders occurred. Investigators who later reviewed the case would identify a much simpler explanation for Boney's involvement. He was not David's accomplice, but the sole perpetrator of the crimes. Charles Boney had a troubling criminal history that had been largely overlooked in the rush to convict David. Between 1993 and 1997, Boney had been convicted of multiple armed robberies targeting women. He had a particular fixation with female feet and shoes, earning him the nickname the Shoe Bandit for stealing women's shoes during his crimes. This fetish would later seem relevant when investigators noted that Kim Camm's shoes had been removed and placed neatly by her body, a detail inconsistent with the chaotic violence of the scene, but aligned with Boney's known proclivities. More damning still, Boney had been released from prison just months before the Camm murders. He had no alibi for the evening of September 28, 2000, and he had a documented history of approaching women in parking lots and garages. But these connections weren't made in 2000, nor in the years immediately following. Instead, as David Camm sat in prison, convicted not once but twice for murders he maintained he didn't commit, Charles Boney remained free until 2005, when the DNA evidence finally linked him to the crime scene. Even then, rather than reconsidering their case against David, prosecutors doubled down, creating an improbable conspiracy theory involving the two men, a theory that required believing that a former state trooper with no criminal record had somehow connected with a violent felon to orchestrate the murder of his own family. In January 2013, as David Camm's third trial approached, the landscape of the case had shifted significantly. This time, the trial would be held in Boone County, Indiana, even further removed from Floyd County than the second trial had been. The change of venue acknowledged the impossibility of finding an impartial jury in a community where the case had dominated headlines for over a decade. David's new defense team, led by Richard Camm and Stacy Juliana, had spent years preparing, determined to avoid the mistakes of previous trials. They assembled a formidable group of forensic experts to challenge the state's blood spatter evidence, which remained central to the prosecution's case despite its controversial nature. This time, Camm told reporters outside the courthouse, the jury will hear the whole truth, not just the parts that fit the prosecution's theory. The third trial began on August 5, 2013, with jury selection lasting several days. When the trial proper began, prosecutor Keith Henderson outlined a case that had evolved yet again. Gone were the accusations of molestation that had tainted the second trial. The alleged motive now centered entirely on the life insurance policies. David Camm stood to gain more than $750,000 from his family's deaths, Henderson told the jury. The evidence will show that he conspired with Charles Boney to commit these murders for financial gain. Richard Camm's opening statement for the defense was a methodical dismantling of the prosecution's narrative. For 13 years, he began, the state has been trying to make the evidence fit their conclusion that David Camm is guilty. They've changed their theory repeatedly. First he acted alone, then he had an accomplice. First the motive was marital discord, then alleged molestation, now insurance money. What hasn't changed is their determination to convict David regardless of the facts, Camm pointed to the jury. You will hear evidence that was never presented to previous juries. You will hear from genuine experts in blood spatter analysis, who will explain why the stains on David's shirt are transfer stains from attempting CPR, not spatter from gunshots. And you will hear about Charles Boney, his violent history, his opportunity, his motive, and the overwhelming physical evidence linking him and him alone to these murders. What followed was the most comprehensive presentation of evidence in any of David's trials. The defense called 13 alibi witnesses who placed David at the basketball game during the time frame when the murders occurred. They presented extended testimony from forensic experts who systematically dismantled the state's blood spatter analysis. Dr. Bart Epstein, a certified blood spatter analyst with decades of experience, testified that the stains on David's T-shirt were consistent with transfer during CPR attempts, not with being present during the shootings. If Mr. Camm had been the shooter, Dr. Epstein explained, there would have been substantially more blood on his clothing and in different patterns than what we observe. The minute droplets cited by the prosecution's experts are more consistent, with blood transferring during close contact with the victim after the shooting. The defense team also delved deeply into Charles Boney's history, presenting evidence that had been overlooked or minimized in previous trials. They highlighted his release from prison just months before the murders, his history of crimes targeting women, and his fetish for female shoes, a detail that suddenly made sense of Camm's neatly removed footwear at the crime scene. Most significantly, they presented a timeline showing that Boney had no alibi for the night of the murders, while David had 11 witnesses placing him at the church gym. The prosecution countered with their own experts, who maintained that the blood stains on David's shirt were high-velocity impact spatter. They brought back Charles Boney, whose testimony once again placed David at the scene as the mastermind of the crimes. But this time, the defense was prepared. During cross-examination, Camm methodically exposed the inconsistencies in Boney's various accounts. He had told at least 5 different versions of events, each one shifting responsibility away from himself and toward David. "Mr. Boney," Camm asked, "is it true that when you were first interviewed about these murders, you denied any involvement whatsoever?" "Yes," Boney admitted. "And then, when your DNA was found at the scene, you changed your story to say you sold a gun to David Camm, but weren't present during the murders." "Yes, and when investigators pointed out that this didn't explain your DNA on Camm's sweater, you changed your story again to say you were present, but didn't participate." "I was clarifying as I remembered more details," Boney insisted. "Mr. Boney, how many different versions of events have you given since your arrest?" Boney shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know exactly." "Would 5 be accurate? 5 different accounts? Each one changing key details about what happened that night?" Maybe I was confused, traumatized. Camm's cross-examination continued, highlighting not just the inconsistencies in Boney's testimony, but also the pronounced similarities between the Camm murders and Boney's previous crimes: the targeting of a woman, the confrontation in a garage, the focus on her shoes. As the trial progressed, the defense also called experts to testify about problems with the initial investigation, the quick focus on David to the exclusion of other suspects, the mishandling of key evidence like the gray sweatshirt, the failure to follow up on unidentified fingerprints and DNA until years after the fact. Floyd County Detective Sean Clemens was recalled to the stand, visibly uncomfortable as Camm questioned him about investigative failures. "Detective Clemens, when was Charles Boney's sweatshirt first discovered at the crime scene?" "On the night of the murders, September 28, 2000. "And when was DNA testing performed on that sweatshirt?" Clemens hesitated. "In 2005, 5 years later." "And why wasn't it tested earlier?" "We didn't see it as a priority at the time." "Because you had already decided David Camm was guilty, correct?" "Objection," Henderson interrupted. "Calls for speculation." "Sustained," the judge ruled. But the point had been made. The investigation had suffered from tunnel vision from the beginning, focusing on David to the exclusion of other explanations, even when physical evidence pointed elsewhere. After 8 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on October 24, 2013. For 10 days, the 12 jurors deliberated, the longest deliberation of any of David's trials. The community held its breath, waiting for a conclusion to a case that had spanned more than 13 years. On October 24, 2013, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman rose to deliver the verdict. On the count of murder in the death of Kimberly Camm, we find the defendant, David Ray Camm, not guilty. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. On the count of murder in the death of Bradley Camm, we find the defendant, David Ray Camm, not guilty. David's supporters began to weep openly. On the count of murder in the death of Jill Camm, we find the defendant, David Ray Camm, not guilty. For a moment, David seemed frozen, unable to process the words he had waited 13 years to hear. Then he collapsed into his attorney's arms, his shoulders shaking with sobs. After 3 trials, after 2,400 days in prison, after missing the funerals of his wife and children and the major milestones of his own life, David Camm was free. Outside the courthouse, speaking to reporters with his family surrounding him, David's voice was raw with emotion. "I've lived this nightmare for 13 years, but it's been a nightmare for both sides of our family. I've lost everything, my wife, my children, a third of my life. But I never lost hope that the truth would prevail." When asked about his plans, David's response was simple. "I just want to go home. I want to start rebuilding what's left of my life." The case that had consumed southern Indiana for more than a decade had finally reached its legal conclusion. But the ripples of its impact continued to spread. In the years following his acquittal, David Camm pursued civil litigation against those he held responsible for his wrongful convictions. In 2016, he settled a wrongful imprisonment lawsuit for $450,000. Charles Boney remains in prison, serving his 225-year sentence for the murders. He continues to maintain that David was involved, though his various accounts of what happened that night remain contradictory and problematic. For many in the community, questions linger. Some remain convinced of David's guilt despite his acquittal. Others see his case as a cautionary tale about the dangers of tunnel vision in criminal investigations, about the fallibility of forensic science, about the difficulty of recovering from the stain of accusation even after exoneration. On a cool autumn evening in 2023, nearly identical to the one on which his life changed forever, David Camm stood in the cemetery where his family is buried. 23 years had passed since he pulled into his garage and discovered the unthinkable. 2 decades of grief, imprisonment, legal battles, and finally a measure of vindication. The headstone bore 3 names: Kimberly, Bradley, and Jill. David placed flowers at its base, a ritual he had been unable to perform for the 13 years. He spent behind bars. At 57, his hair now grey, his face lined with the marks of suffering and resilience, David had rebuilt some semblance of a life. He had earned a degree in operations management. He had become an advocate for the wrongfully convicted, speaking at colleges and legal conferences about the flaws in the criminal justice system that led to his ordeal. But some wounds never fully heal. The suspicious glances from strangers who recognized his name, the lost years that could never be recovered, the milestones he should have witnessed: Brad's graduation, Jill's first day of school, anniversaries with Kim. David's case had left an indelible mark on Indiana's legal landscape. It had exposed critical weaknesses in the handling of forensic evidence, particularly blood spatter analysis, which has come under increasing scrutiny in the years since his trials. It had highlighted the dangers of confirmation bias in criminal investigations, where the drive to solve a case quickly can lead to a focus on a single suspect to the exclusion of other possibilities. For the detectives and prosecutors who had pursued David through 3 trials, the case represented a profound failure, a 13-year quest for justice that had instead perpetuated injustice. Some had publicly defended their actions, insisting they had followed the evidence as they saw it. Others had retreated from public view, their careers shadowed by their involvement in one of Indiana's most controversial cases. Robert Stites, the crime scene photographer whose testimony about blood spatter had been central to the first conviction, had seen his credibility as an expert witness destroyed. Later investigations revealed he had misrepresented his qualifications and experience, calling into question not just his testimony in the Camm case, but in others as well. Floyd County prosecutor Stanley Faith, who had led the first prosecution, had been replaced by Keith Henderson, who pursued the second and third trials with equal determination, despite the evolving evidence. Henderson would later face ethics charges related to seeking a book deal about the Camm case, while still prosecuting it, an alleged conflict of interest that further tainted the proceedings. For the jurors who had convicted David in the first and second trials, his eventual acquittal raised uncomfortable questions about their role in the process. Some had come forward in the years since, expressing regret about their decisions, acknowledging they had not been given complete information. And for Charles Boney, whose connection to the crimes might have been discovered years earlier, had investigators followed all available leads. The case represented a failure of a different kind, a missed opportunity to prevent a miscarriage of justice while properly assigning responsibility for a heinous crime. The Camm murders and the subsequent trials had become more than a local sensation. They had attracted national attention, featured on programs like 48 Hours, Dateline NBC, and numerous true crime podcasts and documentaries. They had become a case study in wrongful conviction, in the limitations of forensic science, in the power of persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. As David placed a small toy beside the flowers, a replica of one Brad had loved, he reflected on the dual legacy of his case. It had destroyed his former life, taken 13 years of his freedom, and left wounds that would never fully heal. But it had also become a powerful example of the importance of critical evaluation of evidence, of the danger of rushing to judgment, of the vital necessity of a criminal justice system that prioritizes truth over conviction rates. For David personally, the path forward remained complex. He had found purpose in advocacy work, in sharing his story to prevent similar miscarriages of justice, but the weight of what had been taken from him, his family, his reputation, his years, would always be with him. As twilight descended on the cemetery, David touched the cold stone of the headstone one last time, before turning to leave. In the distance, the courthouse where he had been convicted twice and finally acquitted was visible, its spire reaching toward the darkening sky. It stood as a reminder of both justice delayed and justice eventually served, of a system that had failed him repeatedly before finally acknowledging the truth he had maintained from the beginning. He was innocent. He had always been innocent, and the evidence, when properly examined without bias or preconception, had ultimately revealed that fundamental fact. The case of David Camm, former state trooper, grieving husband and father, wrongfully convicted, a man, and finally, reluctant symbol of the fight against injustice, had changed the landscape of criminal investigation and prosecution in ways that would ripple through the system for years to come. It had demonstrated with painful clarity that sometimes, despite our best intentions, despite our systems and safeguards, despite our confidence in our own perceptions, the evidence lies, or rather, our interpretation of it does. And in that recognition lay both a caution and a hope, a caution against certainty in uncertain circumstances, and a hope that through acknowledging our fallibility, we might move closer to a system that truly serves justice. As David walked away, from his family's grave, the words he had spoken after his acquittal echoed in his mind. The truth is the truth. It doesn't change. For 13 years, he had clung to that belief through the darkness of prison cells, through the devastation of convictions, through the slow grinding of appeals courts. And in the end, imperfectly, belatedly, the truth had emerged. It was a small consolation for all he had lost. But it was something. It was, perhaps, the only thing that could be salvaged from the tragedy that had claimed his family and transformed his life. The enduring power of truth to prevail, even against the most formidable odds. In the quiet cemetery, as the first stars appeared overhead, that hard-won truth seemed enough, at least for this moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles in his ongoing quest to reform the system that had failed him so profoundly. But tonight, in the presence of the family he had lost, David Camm allowed himself to feel, if not peace, then at least the quiet satisfaction of vindication. He had not killed his family. He had loved them. And now, finally, the world knew it too.